But the point is, it's not like you need to go to some obscure, it's not like you need to go to Mises.org to find out this hidden information. The media is telling us. Every time the federal government does something new, what do they say? They say, not since the 1930s has the federal government had to do such and such. Right? So, I mean, they're telling us that they're doing the same policies now that they did back in the 30s. And in fact, the Federal Reserve is doing things that they didn't even do back then. What Bernanke has done is just exponentially more interventionist and crazy than what they did back then. But it's interesting, like no one stops and hears that and then thinks, well, gee, if the last time they did all these policies, we had a 10-year depression, the worst in U.S. history, why would we do them again now, right? They seem to think that, well, these things are obviously good for the economy, and so, the reason they had to do them back in the 30s was because things were so bad, and they've got the cause and effect backwards. That no, the reason things were so bad in the 30s, the reason that was the longest, worst depression in U.S. history was precisely because that was the closest the U.S. government ever came to outright socialism, right? So, I mean, if you just think about it, we know that countries that literally go socialist, what happens to them, right? Their basket cases, their economy's terrible, their people starve. And so then if you look at the U.S. history and say, okay, well then just when did the U.S. government come the closest to socialism? Well, clearly it was the 1930s and then World War II. And again, was the economy particularly good in that period? No, it was the worst the U.S. economy has ever been. So this isn't, you don't need to delve so much into the theory. Just looking at the basic raw facts, our story is plausible, right? And it's the other side that has to go through these mental gymnastics to come up with reasons to show, well, no, actually, when FDR first got elected, GDP started going up. And sure, unemployment was still 19% in 1939, but, let's not worry about that. I mean, they really have to go through these convoluted explanations. So as far as debt, again, let me just run through some of these numbers. And the thing is, what I'm going to tell you here is coming from the Congressional Budget Office, right? They always refer to as the nonpartisan CBO. So these are the government's own analysts. These are where the figures are coming from, all right? So they, for example, fiscal year 2010, so that's going to end this September 30th, right? The government's accounting years don't line up with the calendar years. They're projecting the deficit will be about $1.5 trillion. And then the next year, for fiscal 2011, the deficit just in that year will be $1.3 trillion. And if you remember, under Bush, before the financial crisis really hit, if deficits were like $300 and $400 billion, that was shocking. You had Democrats with the capital D, denouncing the wild spending of the Republicans if deficits were like $400 billion. That was just shocking. And yet now, I mean, back-to-back deficits, they're over $1 trillion, and we just, we take it for granted at this point. We've been desensitized. Now, the thing that's really scary is you might be thinking, okay, yeah, sure, they're spending a lot of money, but it's because, it's misguided, but they think, or at least their story is, that it's because the economy's so bad and they have to spend all this money to, give a jump start to the economy as stimulus and so on. But then surely, at least according to their own figures, things will get better down the road, and they'll pay for this massive orgy of spending now. But no, they won't, not even according to their own plan. So again, just when this sinks in, I mean, this is if they do what they're telling us they're going to do, and if their cost estimates are what they're projecting, right? So it's infinitely worse than this because, of course, what they're saying is not going to turn out to be right. So according to their own figures, the deficit as a share of the economy, it's going to gently decline as we allegedly are going to pull out of this recession. This is their computer models. They think that we've hit rock bottom and now we're in the recovery, and so they think that it's going to decline until 2014. But then at that point, the deficit starts rising again because of all of the unfunded liabilities, Medicare and so forth, that are built in to the pie, as it were, baked into the pie. All right. So again, according to their own projections, the deficit starts rising again. Again, their own figures, CBO's own figures, by the year 2020, the debt will have increased by $12 trillion to a total of about $20 trillion at that point. In the year 2020 alone, the annual interest payment on the federal debt will be $925 billion. Okay, so in other words, the finance charge just in the year 2020, they're projecting is going to be $925 billion. All right? And again, this is their own figures if everything works out the way they're assuring us it will. This is their plan, okay? This is if everything goes well. That's what the numbers are. Let me just tell you a few reasons why things aren't going to be turning out like this. So for one thing, again, and this is not just a knee-jerk ideological position I have, but this comes from looking at the history of the 1930s. I think that this is going to go down in history as the Second Great Depression. All right, now people are telling us, oh no, we hit rock bottom, we're in the recovery. Well, I hate to tell you this, but people in 1931 thought the same thing. They thought, whoa, those were two pretty awful years since the 29 stock market crash. I'm glad that's behind us. You know, and Herbert Hoover was telling everybody, don't worry, we've because of our big government activism and all, we didn't sit back and do nothing. Herbert Hoover, was pushed through things from Washington to help the common man, and that's why we're pulling out of this thing now. And this was in 1931. They're saying this. All right, so obviously they were wrong then, and I think they're wrong now. And this will be, I believe, the Second Great Depression that it'll be referred to as such years from now. And so in these projections, they're assuming tax revenue recovers, because right now, obviously, tax revenue is low because so many people are out of work. So these numbers are rosy because they're assuming tax revenues come back up. So that's one reason those figures I just told you I think are wildly optimistic. Another reason is, this is a little bit technical, but the way the CBO, they run a bunch of different scenarios. So these numbers are taking what the Obama administration says for its 10-year budget forecast. Saying these are our priorities, this is the legislation we want to put into place, and so on. And so that's what the CBO runs those numbers and comes up with these projections. But then they say, well, what if we try different things? Like, what if we stop, doing a cost of living adjustment for some things, or what if if you're familiar, they have the alternative minimum tax. That continues, like every year, that should be zapping people. A lot of middle-income people should be getting hit with it. But then Congress usually, postpones it because that's not what the original intent was for, because they didn't index it to inflation. And so, the CBO will say, well, what happens if Congress doesn't exempt people and lets the AMT hit middle-class taxpayers, and so we suck more money out of them? What would be the projection? So they have these different scenarios to see what would be the impact on these deficit forecasts if we didn't do the status quo, if we did other things. So in order to compare apples to apples, they hold interest rates constant, and they hold economic growth projections constant, because they just want to isolate, well, what if we tinker with this one program, what happens to the debt figure as of 2020? So if you understand, they're trying to just show if we tweak this one little thing. But the point is, so they're assuming, though, that interest rates, like what the government has to pay to borrow money, isn't going to be affected, even though they're going to add $12 trillion over the next 10 years, according to their own figures. When, of course, that's crazy. Interest rates are not going to be 4% on 10-year bonds if the government keeps running trillion-dollar deficits year after year after year. Okay, so the point is, these numbers, as scary as they are actually quite optimistic, because they weren't putting in some very plausible things that are going to happen. All right, so what do those numbers mean? Well, one way to think about it is, right now, so this is current, this is before all this stuff that I'm telling you is going to happen. Right now, every person, the public debt, what's called the net public debt, meaning the federal government's debt, if you net out the stuff, because some of the debt is like in the Social Security Trust Fund, right? So some of the official government debt, like if you go to the official websites and look at it, it's the government, like one arm of the government owes money to another arm. So like if you net that stuff and just say, how many people outside of the government have IOUs issued by the Treasury, what number is that? And that's, rounding off here, about 8 or 9 trillion right now, or actually it was as of last year. So that right there works out to about $30,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States.